So let's talk a little bit about your early days, man, and just drums in the house. I mean, your father was a drummer, music in the house.
He wasn't a professional musician. He loved drumming. I think he started out when he started playing drums. He had aspirations to be a professional musician, but that didn't happen. So, but he always, had that love of the music, of all music, really. So I grew up hearing a lot of variety in music, but primarily straight ahead jazz, because that's what, was his passion when he was a teenager. And like, for example, he just missed getting to hear Max Roach with Clifford Brown and Sonny Rollins because of the accident, where Clifford Brown was killed in the car crash. Going from Philadelphia to Chicago. And he was all excited. I remember him telling me that he and his friends were very excited in anticipation of getting to hear Clifford Brown in person. So he was like, let's see, that was 1956. My dad was 17. He was not yet 18. So, he was a pretty hip teenager, especially in that era and the neighborhood that he grew up in. It was kind of, north side of Chicago, not necessarily a jazz-centric kind of neighborhood. But that's another story. Right. But yeah, he spent a lot of time as a youngster going to the clubs on the South Side, and hearing the real deal, Blakey and Sonny Rollins and Ahmad Jamal. He loved Ahmad Jamal's trio. He actually took some lessons with Walter Perkins, who played drums with Ahmad Jamal in the 50s. And I still have a drum pad that belonged to my dad that when he took the lessons with Walter, he said Walter put a silver dollar on the pad and took a marker and made a circle around it and said, you got to play your rudiments inside that circle.
Oh,
which is still a challenge,
Man, there's a album talking about the challenges that the Army guys would do. They'd started with the $50, right? Then go to the quarter, and then the nickel, and then the penny, and then the dime.
Oh, come on, that's unbelievable,
man. I was like,
I grew up hearing great, music playing on the turntable. And then he would also take me out to hear great bands, like I saw Max Roach play when I was very young, single digits, like 7, 8 years old. I met Art Blakey at that point, in the early 70s. He just went up to Art Blakey and just started talking to him and told him, this is my son. You're his hero, blah, blah, blah. And Blakey said, oh, yeah? He said, well, let me hear you play, man. And I was like hiding behind my dad. I was so scared,
Did you get up there?
I think I was 8 years old. No. Yeah. Okay. I was, too petrified. But he gave me a 6, it was like he was so nice, so gracious. And one funny aside there, Cozy Cole was in the club that night, and Art, when my dad walked up to him when we walked up together, Art was sitting with Cozy Cole, and Cozy Cole had a chair turned around, and he had some sticks, and he was like warming up, just playing on the chair.
Wow. The records that are in the house, the time that you would spend probably of him. Check this out. Check this out. Check this out. Check this
every day. But I really loved playing drums. So he would put records on and we would listen to things and then he'd show me things, He was actually a good drummer. He had a good touch. He was tasteful. He didn't have like a lot of real crazy chops, but he had a good feel and all the drummers he liked obviously were coming from that good touch and swing feeling. Kenny Clark, Arthur Taylor, Philly Joe, Blakey, of course. So he really was influential in not just exposing me to good music, illustrating what to listen for or highlighting what to listen for. Like listen to the way he plays his ricin, listen to the way he plays these figures, the fours, listen to the phrasing, listen to the sound, the tuning, like how Max tuned. So we would do things like change the tuning of the drums to sound like Max when we're listening to Max. And then I'd try to figure out a part like an introduction of a song, That's Sonny Rollins,
Man.
Like that's what song is that? There's no business like show business off of Sonny Rollins' Work Time, And I used to sit and like listen to the albums, look at the record covers, turn around, read the liner notes. So as a 10-year-old kid, that's kind of unusual.
Well,
I was like a little jazz nerd.
Oh,
but yeah, I spent a lot of time. Just organically learning to play, just organically playing. And then I got more cerebral, I guess, about it in high school. Once I got into high school, I became a music major. I was in concert band and orchestra. It's like, you start getting more serious. But when I was a little kid, it was like play. It was just like another toy in a way, But he would get annoyed too. Like, so when you play with toys, usually your parents don't get annoyed with you. But, if I was doing something, as a matter of fact, there's a recording I have somewhere, a cassette of him, because he had this little cassette player. He would occasionally turn it on and, record.
Yeah.
Playing along with records,
Yeah.
And I was playing along with a Bud Powell record. God, if I can find this, man, I'll send it to you. And I'm playing along with this record. And it's real simple. I must have been like 7 years old or something, and it's just playing time, right, with the brushes. And I got off. Like I turned the beat around. And you can hear him, and he how like when you get close to the tape recorder, there's noise before you shut it off. Like the fingers making the
right.
Yeah. And you just hear like all of a sudden you hear him go, no, get off, you're off, and then you hear clunk, it turns off. Thankfully he got to see me play with not a whole lot of like the legends that I ended up getting to play with, but because he passed away in 1991, and I really started gigging like around 87, 88, but it was mostly locally. But he was real happy that I got to play with people like Von Freeman. He knew I was playing with Von, and Lynn Halliday, another great tenor saxophonist that lived here. Jody Christian, who he used to see when he was, a teenager. He used to see Jody. My dad also educated me he got me familiar with like a lot of the local musicians that were Chicago legends. So I had already heard these names before I actually met them or played with them, like Lynn Halliday, John Young, Jody Christian, Wilbur Campbell, who was a great drummer. You might remember from back when you were around here. Wilbur Campbell was like one of the top bebop drummers in town, who played at the Jazz Showcase real often, backing up, people. So for me, like, getting to play with Jody or getting to play with John Young, I knew it was meaningful.
Right.
It wasn't just like, oh, I'm a young guy and this is an old guy, and I hear he's, this was like, I already knew about these people from when I was young, because he would say, oh, I went to see Johnny Griffin at Roosevelt Jam Sessions, when Joe Siegel, who owned the Jazz Showcase, used to have these sessions at Roosevelt, or sessions on Monday nights that went into the morning. The session would start at like 4 a.m. and go till like 10 a.m.
Man, so
So
much history,
my
man.
dad
So much
said, you could go at 9 in the morning and go to a jam session that had been going from the night before.
Right. Check that out, man.
Yeah. Now most gigs start at 7 o'clock and end by 10. So it's one thing to like, I don't know, James Brown or Earth, Wind and Fire or Stax Records or Motown Records or whatever it is. It's one thing to like it, but it's another thing to like actually know like a little bit more about it, like who the rhythm section people were, what their influences were.
Right.
I mean, I'm not an expert on Benny Benjamin or anything, but I know that most of those cats came up playing some kind of swing. Like they knew how to play some jazz. So that's why their drumming has this feel. It has a bounce, it has a swing or a swagger to it. That's not just like straight up and down. It's it's coming from a different place.
When they were young, that jazz was popular,
right.
The big band, that was the dance music of their day. Man, let's quickly just run through a few of your top influences. I know there's 1,000. There's always 1,000, but let's just go ahead and pick a few that really had an impact on you.
Well, I would say, I've got the early influences, which are the drummers that I was first made aware of, like we were talking about my father, and his influence on kind of, shaping what I was what I was interested in. So I grew up hearing mainly Chico Hamilton, because my dad was a big Chico Hamilton fan.
Wow. Okay.
Max Roach. Roach. He loved those records with Max Roach and Clifford Brown, and the famous quintet that Max had at that time. So these are albums that I just grew up, or drummers I grew up hearing on a daily basis. So those are certainly the most lasting, deepest influences to this day. Art Blakey, Philly Joe Jones. So anything with Miles, with Philly Joe Jones, I was really taken with, just every aspect of Philly Joe's sound, his style, his way of playing the ride cymbal, his way of playing solos, developing ideas, all that stuff. Arthur Taylor is another one. Kenny Clark is another really big one. I used to love the album Walkin', when I was young. I was a kid, and it had a stop sign on the cover. Like, I thought that was such a cool cover, It's also, there's that visual part with records, that makes them attractive, I mean, even to this day, but especially when you're young and everything's new to you and you see these cool record covers, it's like it gets your imagination going. I don't even know what it is about it. It's just a stop sign, or it's just a picture of somebody standing on a street holding a cigarette, but there's something that it just gets. So all of that stuff is part of the influence, In a way, it's an easy question to answer because I can just rattle off all these names: Elvin Jones, Jimmy Cobb, Billy Higgins is a big influence. Roy Haynes. Big influence. Tony Williams a little later. So I didn't really start listening to Tony in depth until I was, I think, about a senior in high school, and then that summer after, I remember like really listening to Four and More and My Funny Valentine and paying attention to what Tony was doing, because I think it was a little beyond what my understanding was, that this young teenage drummer was coming up with all this different vocabulary and way of approaching things. And then as the years move on, there are other drummers like Jeff Watts, Kenny Washington. I admired Lewis Nash. I used to go see him play often with different bands. So those are really like the main influences, though. Any of the jazz legends. And then there's, of course, John Bonham. There's Ian Pace from Deep Purple. So I was a rock head all throughout high school. Mm-hmm. So then there was like that compartmentalized. That's the other influences. Stuart Copeland, I used to like a lot, you know. Mm-hmm. Neil Peart, of course, you know, it's like you can't, how can you not be influenced by him if you're listening to that music, you know? At a certain point, I started listening to more funk and soul than I ever used to, because it's almost like I had blinders on about playing jazz, you know? And when you really delve into something deep, it's almost like you don't have time for anything else, as much as you may like it. Like I've always liked to hear James Brown, or I've always liked to hear Stevie Wonder, but man, I got to really deal with this, you know.
Got to deal with
Billy Higgins records, you know. It's like, you know, everything I hear with Bernard Purdie, it always sounds just right for the song. So that's an influence, to think like, how can I play in a way that always is just right for the song, that I'm serving the tune, you know, whatever the specific parts are. Because this cat could play with so many different genres, and it always sounds right, whether it's Steely Dan or Aretha Franklin or, you know, a soundtrack.
Right.
You know, he just like always sounds right. And he's not playing like rocket science technique stuff. But that's the key. It's like, what is technique then? Is technique only about playing difficult, complicated passages, or is technique also knowing how to just make something perfectly right, you know, for the context?
That's a great question. You know, I always thought Dennis Chambers was a guy that just had phenomenal technique, but he didn't really get credit for that. But then there's other guys who maybe do have great technique that didn't get enough credit for their feel or their musicianship. So you recently had an incredible experience, man, recording at Gelder Studios with the great Eric Alexander. And I remember when you I can't remember if you told me or you must have, I can't remember which one came first. I think you might have said you were going to be recording there.
I've never been there. Of course, a lifelong dream to just see it, you know, even from the outside, let alone go inside and then to actually record in there. For me, it was extra special because I had never been there. So at my age, I started to think, well, man, I don't think it's a bucket list thing that I may not get to, you know?
Right.
Especially since Rudy had passed away a few years ago, and it seemed like the future of the studio may be uncertain. But Don Sickler and his wife Maureen are just doing such a great job running it. They've taken it over, and Maureen worked as Rudy's recording assistant for many years, so they know the place, you know, inside out. I mean, it's part museum, part and mainly active recording studio still.
Right.
So, and you know, just walking in that room, you walk in off the driveway. There's no like ante room or anything like that. You basically just, if you're coming into the studio off the driveway, which is where like a lot of these legendary photographs have been taken, you know, like Coltrane, Love Supreme, he's standing in the driveway, that close up. But when you go in that door right off the driveway, you're in the studio.
Wow.
So that, you know, was like, here you are. It was like walking into some cathedral or some, you know, magnificent historic place that has a spiritual quality.
Right.
You know, it's got a big vaulted ceiling, and you know, immediately I was just like, man, I can't believe all of these recordings that I've grown up, you know, listening to. This is where all this stuff on Blue Note from 1960 basically forward was recorded. So, and then the session itself was really cool because Eric was like, just going to play some tunes, run them down, nothing too complicated, you know. and a great band, Mike Ladon on piano, my friend Dennis Carroll here from Chicago on bass. And George Coleman showed up to record one song with us, which was really special to record. And there was some video footage that was shot there by a good friend of ours, who's a great pianist, young pianist here, Joey Scotia. So he's going to put together some really nice clips from the studio.
Oh, nice. Okay.
And actually, it may turn into a documentary.
Oh, really?
Kind of about Eric and his relationship with George, because we did some interviews. Yeah, there it is. We did some spent some time interviewing George, having a conversation with George Coleman at his apartment after the session. We all went there in the evening after we recorded.
Oh, wow.
And there's about 2 hours of a discussion with the band and George. George is basically just holding court, talking about, the many experiences he's had over the years. So yeah, it was just an incredible experience all around. And I hope to get back. I think we might be doing another session there later this year.
Oh man, that would be incredible.
So that would be great. But yeah.
I mean, coming from, your dad showing you some of those records that were recorded there, and you coming up through those, and then all of us,
I don't see how. Yeah, I mean, I don't see how any jazz musician could have that experience and not feel some kind of like fulfillment, because that's like going to play at Yankee Stadium or something.
Right.
Or if you're a rock and roller and you're playing at the Garden,
Right.
It's hallowed ground. I mean, it's like Love Supreme,
right.
Moment, and Free for All, and where does it? Maiden Voyage, Herbie Hancock, Imperial.
Unbelievable.
George Coleman was in that studio recording that album, right?
Right.
And I'm in that same studio. And again, like for me, it was real special. A lot of guys I know, they've been recording now there over the years. I think LaDon has done many sessions there. I think I heard Kenny Washington has done like 60 some sessions at Van Gelder.
Wow.
But he's a premier drummer on the New York scene. Like I never lived in New York.
Right.
So for me, as far as like full circle, I mean, it feels great knowing like making that choice to stay in Chicago, kind of like Von Freeman did so long ago. I think I'm similar in that respect. I really like Chicago. I've loved living in Chicago. I never really wanted to live in New York per se, like, in Manhattan or Brooklyn. So it feels a little bit more of a privilege to me, not being a New Yorker, to record at Van Gelder.
You guys have lived your whole life for a moment like that,
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's for somebody like myself, or, I'm sure there's other guys that feel like the same. It's like, man, it's a privilege to get a taste of any of that, but man, you've lived it, man.
Well, there's so many musicians, like at a certain point, I was aware of the fact that I probably wasn't going to be moving to New York. And there are different reasons for that, mainly because my father's health, as an only child, I was kind of responsible for helping him when his health was declining.
Right.
But that was early on. I was in my early 20s then. My father died in 1991. He was only 52 years old. So he was younger than me when he passed. And as he declined, he needed more and more help because my parents were divorced. And
of course, right.
And Cheryl and my wife and I were newlyweds at that point. So, we had kind of like, we're just starting our life, but my father needed more help, basically. It was my responsibility to make sure that, my groceries and shopping, things like that he couldn't really do very easily for himself, especially once he got real sick.
Right.
so I knew I was going to have to put off my plans to go to New York, because I really had an intention of moving to New York when I was in college, for those first couple years. And I thought, well, I'll just, help my dad out for a while. And also, I didn't foresee what was going to happen to him. I didn't foresee how quickly he was going to decline. I just accepted the fact that I'm going to stick around, as long as I need to, and then eventually move to New York. But, that's how life goes. You never know how it's going to go. I started working enough locally where I was, basically successful as a working musician in Chicago. And I fostered relationships, I should say forged relationships with great musicians in New York. So I had some musicians who were looking out for me in New York, like Kenny Washington would recommend me for gigs with different people. Johnny Griffin I got to play with. I got to play with Tommy Flanagan, subbing basically for Lewis Nash for, several years. So once that started to happen, I thought, well, maybe I don't need to move to New York, because I've invested time and effort into building relationships with New York musicians on the scene, and it's worked out. It's been, a good thing. Now I've had opportunities to play with these great musicians in New York, but I don't live there. So that was fairly unusual for a musician in Chicago at that time.
Right.
An example would be like Bobby Broom, the great guitar player who I used to play with a lot here. We had a trio. Bobby was a transplant from New York, so he kind of made the opposite move. So he moved from New York to Chicago, but he was based in Chicago, but he was touring with Dr. John. He was doing gigs, touring with Stanley Turrentine. He was in demand.
Right.
He would play with Hugh Masekela. It was like, and he was a very diverse musician too, who could play R&B and funk, as well as being a great, standard standards, jazz, whatever you want to call it, guitar player. But his was sort of the situation flipped. Like, he would go to New York to play with a lot of the cats that like Omar Hakim was a good friend of his. They went to music and art together, So I would look at what Bobby's doing, and I was younger than Bobby, and I think, man, I think this is, like, it's possible for me to work with these great musicians in New York and build these relationships, but I can stay in Chicago, have lower rent, my family's around,
Right.
So that was basically how that evolved.
New York and New Orleans are two of the more seductive, man. They're
right, exactly.
For different reasons, for some of the same reasons and some different reasons, whereas New Orleans is way like more slower pace, but there's a ton of music, a ton of history, and the food. It's addicting, man. It's the same kind of,
Did you live there at any point, or?
No, I mean, I've played a bunch, and I've got a lot of, friends and family and connections down there.
Right. I've only been once. It's one of those places that you would think, like, as a musician, you've been there a lot. I always wanted to go there and play, and the only time I had an opportunity to work a gig there was with Ray Brown, and the gig got canceled. We were supposed to play at Snug Harbor, and the gig got canceled. And then years later, I went on a spring break with my family, and like, I went to see, I think it was one of the Neville sisters. Darn, I can't remember her name. She was killing. It was a great band at Snug Harbor. We heard some good music there, and just ate like, Romans, man. We just ate like,
right.
I mean, I loved it, but I was that's the only time I've been to New Orleans. So
yeah,
I would love to, go back, but New York, I was trying to make a point to go at least a couple times a year. So I would go to New York, it seemed, every few months, you know. And at one point I did have a steady gig in New York where I was there for over 2 months straight. So that was the longest time I spent at one time.
Right.
I got this gig offered to play with Buddy Montgomery, Wes Montgomery's brother, who played piano at the Parker Meridian Hotel in Midtown. And it was a steady gig. It was a 5-night-a-week gig playing at the Parker Meridian.
What year is this?
1990.
And what was
fall
the pay?
Of 90.
What was the pay?
Man, you know, I wish I could remember. I think the pay was like $500 for the week. I think it was like $120 a night, which was good money, I thought, then.
Right.
So, and it was just music 24/7.
24/7.
So after the gig at the Parker Meridian, we'd go hang out at Smalls or go hang out at Augie's, which is now called Smoke. And sessions all the time, hanging out till 4 a.m, getting to bed at 7 a.m., you know.
Right.
It's like, it was like that so often. But that was my taste of like really being in New York.
Right.
And then the other part of that is you get to go hear Roy Haynes' band is playing at Sweet Basil. You know, Art Farmer's playing here. Ron Carter's playing duo with Hank Jones there. You know, all this stuff is happening. It's just like, I couldn't get enough, you know.
Right. So. All right, man. Well, listen, we're gonna close this part one out. I've got a couple.